The one to watch tonight.
Have you ever seen anything more beautiful?
Egypt, tonight at 9, BBC One.
In Asia, a deadly flu virus has jumped from birds to humans and killed 60 people. If bird flu mutates into a virus that we can pass on to one another, we could be facing our most deadly pandemic for 90 years. Panorama analyses the worldwide effort to prevent a natural catastrophe. Bird flu facing the pandemic, tonight, 10:15, BBC One.
This is BBC One Northern Ireland and the Politics Show now with John Sopel and Jim Fitzpatrick.
Hello and welcome. The government's had a grotty week. We ask if it can muster its strength to pursue reform of the health service. This week on the Politics Show, politically the government is on the sick list, but they're looking to regain their punch to press ahead with the next big test, NHS reform. The Health Secretary, Patricia Hewitt, is here. And then there's Europe. Will Tony Blair persuade this quarrelsome family to bury their differences and agree an EU budget?
And in Northern Ireland, do the government's controversial plans for on-the-runs amount to political amnesty? You decide. We've got the full details in an extended programme in half an hour.
We'll also have news of a first-class row over the future of the Royal Mail, and we'll be unveiling some of your nominations for our protest movement competition. That's all after the news with Maura Stewart. Maura.
Thank you. Good afternoon. More than 300 people have been arrested across France as rioting continued for a 10th night. There were arson attacks throughout the country, and for the first time, the violence reached into central Paris. The unrest started after the deaths of two teenagers in a Paris suburb, apparently after being chased by police. Lucy Williamson reports.
Saturday night in Paris, and the worst destruction so far. Among the targets this time, a primary school, a chemist and a fast food restaurant. And more than 1,000 cars lit like torches around the capital and beyond. While the suburbs burned, the police moved in, but they're not popular here, and neither is the government that sent them. On the estates, the message from France's young poor remains the same. Life here must change. The government has promised to end the nightly attacks, but its tactics aren't working, and time is running out. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
The Prime Minister has accused opponents of the government's proposed anti-terror laws of woeful complacency. In an interview with the Sunday Telegraph, Mr. Blair said he believed new powers to allow terror suspects to be held for 90 days were necessary for national security. But he acknowledged he might not be able to get them through Parliament. There'll be cross-party talks to try to reach an agreement tomorrow. Norman Smith reports.
The terror bill may have the backing of the police, but after shelving last week's Commons vote on a 90-day detention period, Downing Street know they'll have to compromise to avoid defeat. Labour rebels are pressing for 28 days, but ministers say that's not acceptable.
This is anti-terrorism legislation. It's not part of our programme that we can trim on in this way. But what we're saying is we think the 90 days is right.
Mr. Blair insists the police have made a compelling case, but the opposition remains sceptical.
I said there's no way near, no way we're going to do that. The simple truth is that 90 days would actually do harm. It would help the terrorist, not harm the terrorist.
And the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, has warned of a threat to basic civil liberties.
I think the 90-day concept is utterly and totally unacceptable in a liberal society. You don't protect our liberties by withdrawing them. And I think to attempt to go to 90 days was a most illiberal concept, and I'm astonished that the government even contemplated.
Tomorrow, Mr Blair will address his MPs to try and rally support. But at the same time, the Home Secretary will be attempting to broker a deal with the opposition and Labour rebels over the terror bill. Norman Smith, BBC News.
11 people have been injured, one of them seriously, after a stray firework went into the crowd during a public display at Wicksteed Park near Kettering. 7 of those hurt are children. One boy has been moved to a specialist burns unit. This morning, the park's management insisted all the right safety measures had been in place. The gay Anglican bishop, Jean Robinson, has called for the Roman Catholic Church's attitude to homosexuality to be confronted. Bishop Robinson, who's on a visit to Britain, attacked the Vatican's recent ban on ordaining gay men, describing it as vile. His ordination as Bishop of New Hampshire has created big divisions in the Anglican Communion. The organisers of the National Lottery Camelot say sales of tickets rose by more than 2% in the first half of the year. That amounts to an extra £55 million worth of tickets. Camelot says the figure marks the biggest growth in sales in the lottery's 11-year history. That's it from the news desk. Back to you, John.
Maura, thanks very much indeed. Well, times are tough. As political understatements go, Tony Blair's assessment to his cabinet of the week must rank highly. One of the central questions raised by the events this week is whether the government will be able to pursue its public service reform agenda. Health is the next target in the government's sights. It wants to change radically the way that healthcare is organised and paid for in England. But with an increasingly mutinous party, will ministers be able to push through measures likely to upset Labour MPs still further? In a moment, I'll talk to the Health Secretary, Patricia Hewitt. But first, Gillian Hargreaves reports.
This is a doctor's surgery fit for the 21st century. Middlewood Polyclinic in Sheffield could have been ideologically designed by Tony Blair. Built by a private company, the GPs provide a range of services: specialist cancer care, mental health and minor surgery. Soon they'll have a diagnostic centre, an arthritis clinic, even a self-employed chiropractor.
The Secretary of State, Patricia Hewitt, wants to see many more polyclinics across England. They are one way of keeping us all out of hospital. She's undertaken one of the biggest consultations ever carried out by the government to ask the likes of you and me what we want from our GPs and surgeries. But healthcare like this will require some fundamental changes to frontline services. And that's controversial. It's also complicated.
There's a vision of potentially opening up a market in primary care provision, that if Tesco's want to run a minor ailment clinic so that you can have your sprained ankle dealt with while you're out shopping, then so be it. If your local pharmacist wants to set up an asthma management clinic, why not? It's local, you can have your asthma sorted out while you're out shopping.
You want to slip your coat off for me?
To allow this, the government has to make some structural changes to what it calls primary care. That's medical attention we all receive outside hospital. 3 years ago, the government introduced primary care trusts. They buy healthcare from hospitals for patients, and they provide services like health visitors and speech therapists. Now the government wants family doctors, rather than PCTs, to purchase more services direct from hospitals. Rebecca Rosen is a health analyst with the think tank King's Fund. She's a busy GP, and she thinks plans for family doctors to offer services currently provided by hospitals could be a mixed blessing.
What it should do, if the theory works, is that it should the competition between different providers should stimulate hospitals to sharpen up their act, to become more efficient, to become more responsive to what patients want so that the patients choose them. There are significant and I think probably genuine concerns that as the cash flows change, shift direction, whole hospitals would be destabilised if one of their departments risks losing income. And that's potentially very important for patients.
Nurses agree it's going to be a painful process. Some community nurses might end up being employed by private companies. That so angered the Royal College of Nursing, they're taking the government to court.
You just relax your shoulder. It means that primary care trusts are no longer going to be providing services, only minimally. This is a huge shift in policy, yet there was no consultation about it. For our members, it's about shifting into the private sector and all that goes with that. And that's an issue and a concern that I know nurses are worried about. They're worried about whether or not they're going to be working for the NHS, whether the NHS is going to be the NHS or just a brand name, no longer providing services.
Nurses beware. If private money creates this standard of healthcare, then the Prime Minister has no objection to it. He says he'll square up to obstructive vested interests. But it might be his own MPs who are the more deadly opposition to the government's plans.
There are loads of people in the Labour Party who are not very happy. We had a private meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and MP after MP raised objections to the plans for their particular area. Certainly I don't want to see anyone but the Primary Care Trust running my local hospital.
And the clamour of opposition is growing. Just this week, health workers and patients gathered outside Downing Street to protest at the closure of community hospitals, currently run by primary care trusts. These are people passionate about the way the NHS is changing. The Tories have been quick to smell blood.
The government are in serious trouble, not least with their own backbenchers. And the reason is because, for a start, they consulted, in inverted commas, on this, starting on the 28th of July after Parliament had risen, and hoping to conclude on the 15th of October, virtually the day Parliament came back. So MPs have had no opportunity at Westminster to pass comment about what's been going on. And I think there are a lot of Labour backbenchers who are very unhappy about that. A lot of my colleagues are very unhappy about that. But the second problem is that the government just don't seem to know what the future pattern of local health services to be. The primary care trusts which they established, they realise now have been a failure. They need to go back to GP fund holding. They need to involve the private sector. They know they ought to give the private sector the freedom to supply services to the NHS. But their own backbenchers hate all this. Their own backbenchers didn't like GP fund holding. They don't like the private sector getting involved. The government know they need to go this direction, but their own backbenchers won't support them.